There's this huge question at the very heart of American government. Just how much power should one person, the president, actually have? Well, that question just got pushed to its absolute limit, all because a single firing threatened to blow up a century of law and completely reshape the presidency as we know it. So picture this, it's March 2025. Rebecca Slaughter, a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, gets this incredibly blunt email from the White House. She's fired. Not for doing anything wrong, but just because her work was, and I'm quoting here, inconsistent with the administration's priorities. And just like that, this one email kicks off a massive constitutional firestorm over the very limits of presidential power. So that brings up the big question, right? Can a president just fire anyone in the executive branch for any reason at all? For almost 100 years, the answer has been a pretty clear no. But this case, which shot all the way up to the Supreme Court, put that entire long-standing rule right in the crosshairs. All right, so here's the game plan for how we're going to unpack all of this. First, we'll look at the firing itself. Then we'll dive into the 90-year-old rule that it shattered. After that, we'll explore this wild theory of total presidential control they used to justify it. And we'll ask the domino question, what else falls if this rule does? And finally, we'll get to the big one. What does this all mean for the future of American government? Okay, so the facts here are pretty straightforward, but wow, are they a big deal? President Trump fired Commissioner Slaughter without cause. Now, that was a direct challenge to the law that created the Federal Trade Commission way back in 1914. That law is super clear. It says a commissioner can only be removed for very specific reasons. We're talking things like inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. Just not liking their policies? Yeah, that was definitely not on the list. So, the FTC is what's known as an independent agency. Congress created a whole bunch of these to handle really complex stuff, the economy, the stock market, nuclear safety. The entire idea was to build a wall between them and the day-to-day political drama of the White House. This was supposed to let nonpartisan experts make calls based on facts and the law, not on who was popular that week. This actually isn't the first time a president has tried to pull this move on an FTC commissioner. And that takes us to the really crucial legal precedent that's at the very center of this whole fight. Let's do a quick history lesson. In 1914, Congress sets up the FTC with that for-cause protection baked right in. Then, in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt tries to fire a commissioner he just doesn't agree with. 2 years later, the Supreme Court unanimously shuts him down. That ruling, Humphrey's Executor, has been the law of the land for 90 years. So this 2025 firing wasn't just some HR move. It was a direct shot at a pillar of American government. So, you might be wondering, how on earth did the government's lawyers try to argue that a 90-year-old unanimous Supreme Court decision was just wrong? Well, they leaned on a legal theory that imagines a very, very different kind of presidency. It's called the unitary executive theory. The argument basically goes like this. Article 2 of the Constitution says, the executive power shall be vested in a president, and followers of this theory take that to mean all of it, no exceptions. So if you work in the executive branch, they believe the president has to have total control over you, including firing you for whatever reason they want. The idea is that this makes things democratically accountable, right? Because the president is the one person we all vote for. And this really gets us to the heart of two totally clashing ideas about how government should work. On one hand, you've got the model Congress has used for a century, independent agencies run by experts built for stability. On the other hand, you have the unitary executive model, direct presidential control built for accountability. And the Supreme Court was basically being asked, okay, which one is it going to be? And let me tell you, the government's lawyer, Solicitor General D. John Sauer, he did not hold back. Calling a 90-year-old precedent a decaying husk and grievously wrong, that is some seriously strong language to use in front of the Supreme Court. It proves they weren't just asking for a little tweak. They were asking the court to say that the way our government has been structured for generations was a dangerous mistake from the start. Okay, so this is where things get really interesting, and it's what seemed to worry the justices the most. It's kind of like a game of Jenga. If you pull this one 90-year-old block out of the tower, what else comes crashing down with it? And you could hear it during the arguments. I mean, justices from all sides, liberal and conservative, kept circling back to this one big question. If the president can fire an FTC commissioner whenever he wants, what stops him from firing the heads of all the other independent agencies? Where does it end? And when you look at the list of what's on the line here, it is absolutely staggering. We're talking about the board that handles labor disputes, the people who watch over our nuclear power plants, and heck, maybe even the Federal Reserve, the folks who manage our entire economy. The very structure of dozens of critical parts of our government could be turned upside down, literally overnight. I mean, get this. During the arguments, the government's own lawyer basically admitted that his logic could apply to around 24 independent agencies. That's not a small number. That's not just a tweak. That is a fundamental rewrite of how Washington works. Justice Sotomayor really just cut right to the chase. This wasn't just about changing a rule. She saw it as a request to tear down the very architecture of modern American government, an architecture built up by Congress and presidents from both parties for more than 100 years. Which brings us to the final, and really the most fundamental question. At the heart of this entire case, what kind of government do we actually want? One built on independent expertise, or one built on direct, top-down presidential accountability?
So on one side, you have Justices Kagan and Jackson, who talked about this kind of bargain. The deal is, Congress creates these powerful agencies to solve tough problems, but in exchange, those agencies have to stay independent. But on the other side, the government argued for a mandate. They said the president is the only one elected by everybody, so to deliver on that mandate, he's got to have control. The accountability flows from the official to the president and then ultimately back to the voters.
And Justice Kagan really drove this point home. She warned that since these agencies do more than just enforce laws, they write rules, they decide cases, which, sounds a lot like what Congress and the courts do, giving all of that to the president risks creating what she called massive, unchecked, uncontrolled presidential power. It's a huge warning about the separation of powers. So, at the end of the day, this is the choice the Supreme Court was facing, and it's one of the biggest you can imagine in our system of government. Is the government run by the singular will of the president, who we hold accountable every 4 years? Or is it run by the complex structures and the specific laws passed by Congress, which is designed to represent all of us? The answer they give is going to define the balance of power for a long, long time.